Okay, welcome to PASECO's panel discussion on an introduction to co-production, lessons and resources for early career researchers to build a platform of long-lasting research relationships. I'm Mariama Dryak. I'm the director for the Polar Science Early Career Community Office, or PASECO, which is a national level office supporting polar scientists early in their careers through community building, professional development, funding, and more. And PASECO is hosted at CU Boulder in 2 institutes there, Ceres and InStar. We have with us today Natasha or Tash Haycock Chavez, PASECO Advisory Board member and moderator for the panel today. If you could give a wave, Tash, so folks can see you, that'd be great. So Tash will be taking it away here shortly. We also have with us today Lori Powell. Lori is a colleague of mine at Ceres Education and Outreach at CU Boulder, and she'll be helping us with technical support, sharing links, etc. So if you have any technical glitches along the way, feel free to reach out to Lori or myself, and we can make sure that you're able to fully engage. And finally, we have 4 wonderful panelists with us today who Tosh will introduce shortly. If you could give a wave if you're a panelist, that would be great. We want to begin our event today with a land acknowledgement. PASECO supports polar scientists in locations across the United States with research focused on both poles and in high alpine regions across the world. We acknowledge that much of that science takes place on the unceded traditional territories and ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples. And with that, some of the science done in these locations have historical roots in colonialism. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to our understanding of the polar regions and recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed and continue to develop in relationship to their lands. At the core of PASECO is inclusion, and so we expect that all attendees here with us today adhere to PASECO's community guidelines when interfacing with others on the call. Lori will be posting a link to the community guidelines in the chat for your reference. Next, we want to go over an outline of the call today. So we'll begin, as we are, with introductions and a welcome. Next, we'll hear from panelists for introductions and hearing from their experiences and insight related to co-production and relationship building with Indigenous communities in the Arctic. And then we'll have a moderated discussion where Tash will be asking some questions that have been prepared ahead of time. And for the last half hour of the call, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions to the panelists yourselves. And you can ask those questions using our Menti link. So you can access the question answering thing or platform thing, platform via the link that will be posted in the chat by Lori. Or you can use your phone to scan this QR code or go to menti.com and enter this code. All of those ways will get you to a question asking platform where you can submit your questions, and you can also upvote questions that you would really like addressed. And that helps us understand, because inevitably there will likely be more questions than we can get to, which to prioritize. So we will share that again, but I highly recommend you having that link up so that as questions arise, you can ask them in real time. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Tash to introduce the panelists. I'm really excited for the panel today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mariama, for the introduction and overview. Like Mariama said, I'm Tash. I'm on the PASECO Advisory Board. Just to briefly introduce myself, I work for ALOCA, which stands for the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic. My academic background is in geography, and for my master's, I was invited by the Arctic Ider Society and the Canadian Sennekiloaq in Nunavut, Canada, to be a graduate student on the community's conservation project. I grew up in Bellingham, Washington. My family is all over the place. My mom's side is in England, and my father is Indigenous in Chicano. My interest and passion in Indigenous-led research is both academic and it's personal. I'm really excited to moderate the discussion today and to learn from all of our amazing panelists. wanted to spend a couple of minutes hearing from our panelists just to introduce themselves. Can we start with Julia, and then I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Tosh. My name is Julia Christensen. I'm an associate professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Queen's campus is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, and Kingston itself is included in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for these lands, for this region, for the Lake Ontario region and resources in particular. I was born and raised in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, Canada, on the traditional territory of the Yellowknife's Dene First Nation, the Clichon First Nation, Chief Dry Geese Territory. I was really privileged to grow up in those beautiful lands, which really informed who I am today, both as a person, in relation with family and friends and community, and then also the approach that I take to my work, which these days is by and large as a mentor and guide with graduate students who form the Research Storytelling Lab, which I lead, as well as a large Northern housing partnership called At Home in the North that includes Northern and Indigenous governments and community-based organizations from across the territorial and provincial norths of Canada. And my career thus far, the last 15 years of research in the areas of Northern housing, homelessness, and home and health has been done primarily actively in partnership and collaboration with Northern and Indigenous communities. And I'm very, very excited to be here today. Thank you for including me.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for being here. If we could have Margaret Rudolf go next, please.
Hi, my name is Margaret Rudolf. My Inupiat name is Anamak. My family originally comes from King Island, but I grew up in Fairbanks and in Anchorage. I am finishing up my interdisciplinary PhD at the University of Alaska Fairbanks on the unceded territory of the Lower Dene. I study co-production of knowledge, which is a bit odd. My background is in permafrost and engineering, and my PhD, being interdisciplinary, I pull from sustainability science, Indigenous studies. Our Indigenous studies program also overlaps a lot with education and Indigenous education, and so there's some of those elements in it as well as social science. And my research is is a bit of an interest because I study co-production knowledge. So I did 4 papers for my dissertation, which I defended in April, but just still doing some edits to graduate this summer. So the 4 papers, one is a synthesis paper, looking at what are the factors to create co-production knowledge in a successful project from co-production knowledge literature, as well as other collaborative approaches such as Indigenous methodologies. And then my second paper is a critical analysis on co-production of knowledge, both the theory and implementation from an Indigenous standpoint. And then my third paper, I did a co-production knowledge project on the roles of boundary spanners, those people who facilitate research projects quite often between communities, research institutions, as well as quite often policy committees, policymaking, those types of elements in the context of working with Alaska Native communities on climate change research. And so it was co-production in the sense of supporting the self-definition of what that role looks like. And then my fourth paper was looking at the different perspectives of what is success in improving Arctic observing from scientist perspective as well as Indigenous perspectives. That one I tried to do as co-produced as possible, but we're looking at 30 to 40 people participating. And so doing co-analysis in that was pretty hard to attain and get commitment for. And so I wouldn't consider that co-production knowledge. I tried as hard as possible. But when I used a rapid assessment approach to do, so I did a set of focus groups and then kind of iterative feedback on that. So yeah, I think that kind of is a good overview of kind of where I'm coming from.
Great, thank you, Margaret. If we could have Dr. Noor Johnson, would you mind introducing yourself next, please?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Noor Johnson, and I am a research scientist and a social scientist by training. My doctorate is in cultural anthropology. I work at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, which is a center at the University of Colorado Boulder. But I live and work from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts and the Patuxet peoples. And I am a research scientist, and that means that I lead and support different collaborative projects. And across all of the projects, what they have in common is they involve collaboration of Indigenous communities, organizations, or individuals. And so I think, today I'll be sharing from my experience working across a number of different projects. But just as an introduction, I will say that I started my Arctic research as a doctoral student at McGill University. And I did not start in the tradition of co-production. I started in a much more traditional, classic academic approach to research. And what I was studying was the production of climate knowledge in the North in Canada. And I did what in anthropology is called a multi-sited ethnography. So I was very lucky to spend some time in a small community in Nunavut, Kangik-Tungapik or Clyde River. And then I spent some time looking at politics of knowledge production in the government of Nunavut. And then I spent some time with the Inuit Circumpolar Council and worked with them and accompanied them in their work in the Arctic Council and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so it was from, some of those early experiences as a doctoral student where my project was not co-produced, but I was really trying to study and understand the politics of knowledge production and the sites of conflict and then sometimes cooperation that were happening around how do we improve the way that Inuit knowledge is actually informing and supporting research and decision-making and policy. And so, some of the personal tensions and discomforts of doing a project that was not co-produced, but was looking at those dynamics, I think motivated me as I continued in Arctic research to change the way that I was, working and collaborating. And so personally, my work has evolved more towards co-production, but even the different projects that I'm involved with, not all of them are really co-production. Some of them are more co-produced than others. And so we can hopefully have some time to talk about what some of those differences are later on in this panel. So thanks for inviting me to join you today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Noor. Excuse me. And can we have Stanislav Saas Ksenofontov introduce themselves next, please?
Thank you, Tash. I'm really sorry that I don't have my camera on. I have some technical issues. So yeah, Dorabulurun minatum saftin min sahasiritin trittakpin olganan baran biligin ayowaka miskwaki tidlaragarolorobun. Hello, everybody. My name is Saas Ksenofontov, and I'm originally from Sakha Republic in Northeast Siberia, Russia. But I'm currently based in Iowa, native lands of Meskwaki people. And I work as a postdoctoral scholar at the Arctic Center, University of Northern Iowa. I'm pretty new to co-production of knowledge, but I was co-producing knowledge with my fellow Taha people Sakha, Evenki, and Eveni people in North Sakha land. So I did my PhD. I have a background in human geography, and I did my PhD in Switzerland. And I was co-producing knowledge with my fellow community members about vulnerabilities of indigenous communities, of my community, to global change drivers, namely climate change, industrial development, or socio-political transformations. And yeah, co-production is really important to get into, to co-create something new together with Western science, because sometimes Western science cannot explain issues and processes that take place in our lands, on our lands. For example, snow processes, or for example, in Sakha, we have 77 types of snow, which cannot be explained by scientific record. So we can tell that this snow is this and that, depending on its quality or in its texture or time of fall. So we can explain something important for our hunters or fishers. So I think co-production of knowledge, co-creation, I would say, co-creation of knowledge with our communities is super important. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you everybody for your introductions. I'm really excited for this panel discussion. So as we all know, this panel discussion is to introduce co-production of knowledge. So I really wanted to start at the very beginning and have everybody talk about what that means to them. As we can already tell from everybody's introductions, co-production can take place in many different ways and in many different types of research. So I'd love to just start with what co-production means to you and what your experience with co-production of knowledge is. I know we've heard a little bit about this already, but if we could go a little bit deeper into that. And if we could also include a few aspects that have made co-production of knowledge successful, or a few aspects that you think are necessary for success. I'd love to go in the opposite order that we did introductions. So if we could start with Saas.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So to me, so I would like to tell, first of all, that these perspectives are all my own perspectives and experiences as an indigenous scholar from Sakha in Siberia. And they may not apply to your own research or your experiences, so please don't be very critical. So to me, knowledge co-production should not be a colonial, top-down, one-way exploitative research for the sake of own success, benefits, funding opportunities, but it should be decolonial, meaningful, equitable, respectful, mutual cooperation to co-create knowledge for the needs of both community and researchers. In my research, I'm always trying to co-produce knowledge with indigenous knowledge holders, with my fellow Sakha, Evenki, Eveni people on issues that are important for communities. And for a successful co-production of knowledge, we should look at this process from an indigenous point of view, not a Western scientist. We should consider indigenous knowledge, indigenous worldviews, cosmologies. For example, Western scientists perceive Arctic infrastructures as an opportunity or development for local communities, while most of the indigenous scholars would view them as the colonial invasion, infrastructural violence, destruction, and many other things. In addition, for the successful indigenous Arctic research, we should co-design research with the communities from the very first stage, considering interest and needs of the communities for mutually beneficial and convergent outcomes. It is necessary to co-produce knowledge with the indigenous communities, right? So this co-production may bring different perspectives of understanding various natural and social processes and issues. So indigenous knowledge, which is important in co-production of knowledge, may complement Western science and explain some processes that science may not explain. And as I mentioned earlier, in Sakha, in our culture, we have 77 types of snow, depending on its quality, time of fall, texture, and this may not be explained by scientists. For example, also another example is that permafrost scientists can describe geomorphological formations, but these formations may have cultural or spiritual meanings to us. For example, we have this formation, which is called Alas. And this formation is perceived as a geomorphological formation, but Alas for us is more than a thermokarst formation, but culturally, socially, and spiritually important space. And I would also say that we should, scientists should co-design, as I mentioned, co-analyze, co-evaluate, and co-disseminate results together with the research partners, with the community members. And co-production would become successful if the research follows community ethical guidelines, such as the one that Inuit have developed and published last year. Co-production and community engagement are unsuccessful when researchers involve communities or indigenous individuals for checking the diversity or indigenous box purposes. Co-production of knowledge takes place not only with scientists, but also, most importantly, with policymakers who most of the time make decisions on behalf of indigenous communities without taking our needs into account, be it nature conservation, fishing regulations, language revitalization, and so forth. Co-production of knowledge is important in policymaking processes in Arctic homelands where we live. And these policies are usually designed and implemented top-down without taking our knowledge and needs into account. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate everything that you said. And I think it's really important to highlight that research needs to be co-designed for co-production. So thank you for that. Can we have Noor go next, please? Let me know if you need me to repeat any parts of the question too. It's kind of a long question.
Okay, I'll just do my best, and you can prompt me if I missed something. Well, that was a wonderful definition and a lot of depth in it. So I will follow up with a shorter definition and maybe share some examples from the work that I'm involved with now. So for me, co-production of knowledge involves deep collaboration between people who have very different ways of knowing and understanding the world. And the focus of projects that use co-production is really on the process of learning together. So, you know, traditionally in academic research, you're very focused on the outcomes and the data and the products that come from the research. And, you know, from the co-production, the projects that use co-production that I've been involved with, a huge amount of the learning is really just about the process and the relationships that form and the way that you form those relationships. And I think in a co-production project, the knowledge that comes out of the process is much deeper and richer and more nuanced than it would be if you weren't really engaging the different ways of knowing in a in the process of that investigation together or the learning together. To me, a good co-production of knowledge project also has a clear sense of how the knowledge will be used or applied. And the use is in service to goals that are not just academic goals, and in fact, would prioritize the information needs of community members or collaborators that were coming to the partnership or the project from outside of the academy. So there's a real emphasis on, putting that knowledge to use to support community goals or community information needs. And I think I've been involved in several projects that use different elements of co-production. I think not all of them are necessarily fully co-produced. And I like what you said earlier, Tosh, just that, there are different kinds of projects that engage co-production. So one of the projects that I have been involved with and learned a lot from is the Indigenous Foods Knowledges Network. And I don't know that I would say it's a co-production project, partly because it's not a research project, it's a network building project. But we have tried to use a co-production approach to grow the network and to learn together through the network. So that project involves Indigenous communities from Alaska and the Southwest, and we have been meeting over the past 5 years for place-based meetings where we exchange knowledge about Indigenous food sovereignty efforts at the local level or the community level. And the meetings are always guided by our host. Whoever is hosting us helps develop the agenda and decides, engages local knowledge holders and experts and identifies the knowledge that they think is really relevant and they want to share. It's not a research project in that we haven't been documenting the learning. The exchange itself is what we're supporting. And so individuals who participate are learning together. But it is co-produced because I think the elements of that project that were really well co-produced is that in the beginning of the project, the group developed a charter of how we wanted to work together that was informed by Indigenous methodologies and particularly, ethics of relationship with place and with community. And we've tried to follow that, and we've been guided by different members of the network who share feedback about where to meet and what they want to learn. And our hosts are the experts and the ones who get to really decide how we meet together and what we learn. We also try to resource expertise in, it's not fully equitable, but we pay the host to host us. We pay knowledge holders who share their knowledge with us. And we've paid our steering committee, that's our Indigenous steering committee that's helped, sort of guide the project all along. And then we've invited people to be part of our publication process to identify what we want to share with others and to add their names as experts to our publications and also to different conference presentations. So that's, coming as an academic, a non-Indigenous academic, you can hear all of the elements of, it's sort of fitting co-production into a sort of traditional research model, but still I think there are elements of co-production that I've appreciated that are part of that project. One more project I'll mention that I'm involved with is the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic. Tosh mentioned earlier ILOCA. And ILOCA does not, I would say again, is not fully co-producing our work together, but we're trying to move in that direction. And we're actually also not primarily a research entity. We are a service provider. We support and work with communities that and researchers that are engaged in community collaborative projects to ethically store and share their data and their knowledge from those projects. So, I think I won't go into a lot of detail except to say that the ways that we're evolving as an organization are kind of away from some of the technical elements of that and towards more knowledge sharing and having our partners be experts and learning from one another from in-person meetings and from online focus groups or working groups where people share knowledge. So we're trying to evolve our model to be more co-produced. But again, I think, to me, it's like, there's no point at which I'll be like, okay, yes, this is fully using co-production, because it seems like there's always ways to improve. And there's always really big obstacles, especially when you're based at a university and working within the sort of university research system. So maybe we can eventually talk more about some of those obstacles and ways to try to address them. So I don't know if I answered all the parts of your question, Tosh. Maybe we can come back to them, or if there's more you want me to say now, just let me know.
No, that was great. Thank you so much for all of the examples. And I really appreciated hearing about ways to improve co-production. And the transparency there, which is really wonderful. Can we have Margaret go next? What does co-production mean to you? And what are some aspects?
So I think it makes the most sense to me to kind of give like a current status of where the literature is at in co-production knowledge. That's what I study. And so kind of the way I describe it to people is that I think, if I was talking to more of an Indigenous audience, I would just talk about it in the sense of like really a meaningful relationship, partnership, collaboration. And then researchers really like to intellectualize it. But it is a growing field. I think it's really interesting. Co-production of knowledge, really the roots of it is coming from the science policy interface field. And so it's a very practical sense of how do we get scientific knowledge used. Observations, data, those types of things by policymakers, by people in general. And so it's this very practical aspect. And as it's kind of grown, it's really started intersecting a lot more with the social sciences, because there's a lot of overlap, obviously, with the concept with community-based participatory action research and other approaches, as well as now it's really interfacing a lot with critical methodologies and Indigenous methodologies. So I think it's a really interesting space. There's not necessarily a set definition. Where there is probably the strongest agreement is in the sense that you need to co-produce every single step of the research process. And so this means working with your partners on defining the problem, the research questions, working on the proposals together, on developing the methods together, doing co-analysis, co-dissemination of the results. So every single step of the research process you're doing with your community partners, whoever they may be, whether they are Indigenous communities or whether they're policymakers, basically non-academics is kind of the definition of what would be co-production knowledge. One paper I really like and reference in the sense of like what is co-production knowledge versus not is Nordstrom et al. I'm putting the link in the chat. And they have the 4 principles of co-production knowledge, which is pluralistic. So that means it needs to have 2 or more knowledge systems to be co-production knowledge. So this could be scientific and Indigenous knowledge systems would be an example. And needs to be interactive. So that thing of like co-producing every single step of the research process, that element is not the second principle. And then there's goal-oriented as well as context-based. So I usually talk about them together because I think a lot of research is creating generalizable knowledge. And so there's a tendency to go to the abstract. And when you do that, then you're not really creating results and products that are useful for your community partners. And so it's something really to keep in mind of this practical aspect doing co-production knowledge. And the way I kind of think about another paper I think is really relevant is the Yua, pasting it in the chat now, co-production knowledge framework. So this is relevant to Arctic research and working with Indigenous communities. And so really they took the co-production knowledge model and then layered on top of it really these Indigenous engagement methodologies. So Indigenous methodologies, as well as like decolonial methodologies. A lot of what Saas talks about is included in this. And I think that's really kind of that intersection is really important to consider, because I think if you're going to try to do co-production knowledge with in Indigenous communities, those are the type of things you need to do in order to even achieve it. And so I think whoever your partner is really going to depend on like what you necessarily do in co-production of knowledge. Otherwise, it's, I think, a very flexible framework that you can kind of take in different directions, different approaches in it. So yeah, that's kind of my brief overview of how I talk about co-production knowledge.
That's great, Margaret. Thank you. I really appreciate hearing that perspective, and thank you for sharing those papers. Last but not least, Julia, would you mind talking a little bit about your experience with co-production?
Of course, thank you. I'll just start by saying that everything that the previous panelists have offered in terms of what co-production means to them and their experiences have certainly resonated deeply for me. And of course, this idea that co-production happens in a variety of different ways, that we could think about it as a spectrum as well. The goal, the ultimate goal to be in full co-production, but recognizing that there are, there's other realities and other possibilities kind of earlier on in the spectrum. And I also wanted to say too that when Tosh reached out to me about participating in this panel, I was very excited because it provides an opportunity to kind of reflect on things that in some sense I take for granted, because it's just sort of the way that I couldn't really picture going about research in any other way. And part of that is very much being, born and raised in Denendeh as a non-Indigenous person on Chief Dragi's territory, in the sense of responsibility that I've always kind of carried forward to do research and pursue a career and work that would ultimately be really rooted, really grounded in home, and grounded in relationships with people at home. A sense of responsibility for an ethical, reciprocal, and respectful process that results in outcomes that are of use to community members, but that also seeks to generate positive change as defined by community members and research participants. So there's these pieces that are part of co-production for me that are difficult in a sense to intellectualize, because they're very much rooted in a value that I give to relationships and relationships for relationships' sake. So, seeking to always make connections with other people and communities to get a sense of what the big kind of challenges and excitements and visions are for community members, meeting with people and talking just for the sake of doing those things. And then as my career as a researcher started to develop, being placed more and more in a role as an advocate for people with lived experience of homelessness and housing insecurity, for example, as an interlocutor in terms of bringing policymakers and program developers and funders together with people with lived experience so that they could make decisions that were informed by the very people that would be using those programs or hopefully benefiting from policy change, and giving time and resources according to community identified needs, well before any efforts to develop any kind of concrete research project together. So seeing a place for me as a researcher to provide service and to provide, to provide my time and resources and work when community organizations would reach out for particular knowledge needs, and valuing the relationships that resulted from those collaborations. When I reflect on co-production in my own work, I see very much partnership and collaboration across all stages of, from identifying those research questions, developing and designing research, implementing it, and then ultimately communicating it. So exploring tools for research communication that are directed by community members, by my collaborators and partners. Certainly, of course, bringing together different knowledge systems. In my case, it's very much bringing together Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous experiences, and Indigenous methods and methodologies with policy language and governance across all scales. At home in the North, the large Northern housing network that I lead is also very transdisciplinary. We have people rooted in different knowledge systems, but then also rooted in different disciplines, rooted in different places. So community-based researchers, university-based researchers, Indigenous and Northern public governments across all scales. And using research in the context of that partnership, again, as a tool to bring different sides together. So policy and governance, researchers at the community and university levels, and then also Northern and Indigenous communities. There was a comment that I think, or an offering, an experience that I believe Noor offered about partnership agreements. And At Home in the North began, we brought people that were interested in participating in this work together. It began with a discussion around what it was that everyone needed to get out of, or hoped to get out of this process, what was required for them to feel safe and secure and to feel that this was a reciprocal collaboration, what was ethical research, ethical co-production to them. We developed this partnership agreement collaboratively and everyone signed it, and that really formed the kind of basic foundational understanding of our network and our research activities together. When it comes to my work with graduate students, we also, with the Research Storytelling Lab, also have a collaborative agreement that we developed together and that we revisit every year, adding things, talking about things that need to change. And again, coming from a place where within the setting of our Research Storytelling Lab, we have students that are representing Indigenous ways of knowing, as well as Western scientific ways of knowing that they've learned at the university institution. We have people who haven't been steeped in Indigenous knowledge, haven't grown up in an Indigenous community context, to identify in other ways, as settler, as non-Indigenous, as international or newcomer student. And so bringing together, recognizing the graduate student space as a collaborative space of knowledge co-production as well, and what we need to do in order to ensure that that's a safe and secure and reciprocal and ethical environment for everyone. A couple other things, I've learned very much that listening is the most important skill to have when it comes to knowledge co-production, and that's something that comes more naturally to some people over others. And so, identifying that as a real skill to be able to accept that, you don't have to be the expert in the room, and in fact, are not the expert in the room. And what does that mean to kind of take that step back and just listen to knowledge holders and listen to the knowledge that they're bringing forward, being reflexive and reflecting on who needs to be at the table when it comes to, co-production in a particular setting, who isn't at the table, and what needs to be done in order to commit to changing that. Teaching as well at all levels. I teach a course here called Geographies of Indigenous Settler Relations. And I approach that course very much too from the perspective that it's an opportunity for the co-production of knowledge. We have within the classroom students who identify as non-Indigenous, settler, as Indigenous, as newcomer, and we collaborate again on creating an agreement within the classroom, what it is that we need in order for this to be a reciprocal, a respectful space, what we hope to walk away from the course with in terms of our knowledge, and engaging with, you know, scholarship, writing, creative works that come from Indigenous producers and knowledge holders, as well as non-Indigenous knowledge holders that are approaching these same questions around relationship from different perspectives. So seeing co-production too as an opportunity with respect to teaching, and the teaching and research as a dialogue for me. So I will stop there, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that. And that really leads well into our next question. Just looking at the time, we have 15 minutes left for our moderated discussion, and we have 2 big questions left. I realized that first question was a very big question. So this next question is something that I get asked about a lot, and it's about relationships. From everybody's answers, it seems like relationships are really at the core and foundation of co-production. And so I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about relationship building and how these relationships were initiated. How have you created long-lasting relationships? And especially when it comes to having tight research deadlines. So given that we just have 15 minutes left, I was going to ask if one or two panelists would be interested in answering this question. Feel free to unmute yourself. Great. Margaret, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's really needing to separate out your relationships from projects, in the sense that you really need to start building relationships outside that context of projects and productivity. When I started my PhD, that was probably the advice I had, is just talk to people and like understand the community. So I was interested in like, how do we improve working with Alaska Native communities on climate change research? And so, you know, there are people who write on that subject. I reach out to them. They really became my mentors as well as collaborators. They gave really good advice on like what should be studied, as well as like where, like what conferences and stuff I should go to. And those elements, I think a lot of people go with that mindset of co-production, especially with working with Alaska Native communities, is just like jump right into like going to the community. But that's like asking a lot of that community. So like, it's like putting a lot of burden on them, versus I think there are a lot of these intermediary type things. So if you're doing, you know, if you're interested in a certain marine mammal, there are a lot of co-management groups within Alaska on the different marine mammals. If you're doing something more on erosion, again, there are working groups and conferences around those types of things. So like in Alaska, there's Alaska Forum and the Environment is a great like introductory conference to start going to if you're brand new to kind of this space. And so I think that that's kind of important. And then it's just like, you know, really it's this informal networking and talking about things, being really open to learn and eager to learn, as well as being eager to represent, having this reciprocity with people. Because I think through starting to introduce myself with people, people are usually eager to like mentor you or like give you advice, like meet you a little bit. And then through that, they're like, you know, I need help with this workshop. I need help with this paper. Would you be interested in writing this? Would you be interested in like being part of this project? Or, you know, can we work on this conference together? Things like that, I think just starts opening the doors. And so I think that's kind of the thing, is just this element of really starting to build relationships, really thinking about acts outside of academia even, is kind of what I think would be really important.
That was great. Thank you, Margaret. Julia, did I see your hand go up to answer this? Okay.
Yeah, I did. I just, what Margaret just said is exactly the, you know, the sort of the first point that I had jotted down in response to this question, that valuing of relationships across all areas of life. not, seeking to sort of think about relationships in terms of research relationships and other relationships, but really recognizing the blending of those and how they can shift and change over time. But one of the points that I wanted to add is really seeking to build a legacy of partnership and collaboration. So when those relationships become established or start to be established in terms of working on, projects together, asking then, well, what are the next questions that emerge from this work? Is there a desire to continue to work together? Is this a collaboration that is well functioning and productive, and moving forward with that relationship? There tends to be in sort of the research world, an emphasis on kind of chasing the new hot topic, or trying to increase kind of the geographical scope of your work. Certainly I received that advice as a PhD student, that I needed to think beyond the Canadian, beyond the Northwest Territories, to think, kind of pan-Northern within the context of Northern Canada, or even better, the circumpolar North. And of course, I've done some co-production research outside the Northern Canadian context, but that kind of pressure to be trying to cast a wide net really makes the quality and the sustainability, or threatens, I think, in some ways, the quality and sustainability of partnerships, especially at early career stage, where there's just, that experience, that time hasn't been there. You haven't been able to invest it. So I think I would encourage people to really remain steadfast in the importance and value of those core partnerships, core collaborations, and where there is a desire to maybe look cross-contextually or look across a broader region, to look out for who other scholars and other community groups are that are doing research, co-production of knowledge work that that aligns with your own, and thinking about collaborating with those groups, with those collaborations and partnerships, rather than feeling like you need to have a broader reach that might not be sustainable or might kind of dilute that sense of co-production. So building on that legacy from project to project, I think is really important.
Thank you. Both of those answers were really great. And I really love the idea of thinking about relationships outside of academia, thinking about them beyond research, and then building on them. So we have one last question for our moderated part of this discussion panel. We wanted to consider early career folks and their positionality. Early career researchers are often working within the confines of a fairly short timeline, expected to produce on timelines that are tied to fixed term grants to advance within the academic system. What is your advice to early career folks who want to invest in meaningful relationship building, but are working within this system? And if you have any suggestions of how early career folks can address the need for funding time at the front end of building relationships to have the potential to lead to a long-lasting co-production partnership, even when there isn't a data outcome that this is supporting. So I wanted to start with Noor and Saas. Noor, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I can share some thoughts. Yeah, this is such a hard question, I think, because it is hard to feel like you want to take the time and develop relationships, and being aware that does take time, and then also being under pressure to finish your degree and move on with things. So I guess, ideally the best pathway is to find mentors that you could work with who have experience doing co-production of knowledge and have some relationships, and can help introduce you as their mentee or their student. And that can be a really helpful for everybody, because it gives you as a student or an early career researcher, someone with who can really serve as your guide and share, from their experience. Not everybody has that, but I think you can find that even if your supervisor is not that person, there are ways to reach out to people who do have experience and, to try to have conversations with them and get that mentorship in other ways than necessarily the traditional, your supervisor or your committee or as a doctoral student or a postdoc. And then I think it's also really helpful to be clear with community members and partners about your time constraints, early on. So if you know that you need to complete a project by a certain date, or that you don't have funding past a certain date to finish, if you share that information up front and allow people to choose to collaborate or not, that's probably a better approach than not sharing that information and then coming in later on and saying, oh, actually now we're really in a rush. I have to get this done and wrapped up. So that's another strategy that people can use. I do think that it's helpful for researchers to communicate about our awareness of the problems of the system that we're working in, and to just acknowledge that we can't necessarily fix the system, but we can do everything we can to address issues of equity and address issues of power, and that we'll do our best. However, these are the constraints that I'm working under. So just trying to be clear, because a lot of times community partners they've never worked in a research environment or in an academic institution, and they're just not aware of some of those, barriers or constraints. And I guess I have two more pieces of advice. One is to be humble in your ambitions. So, rather than tackling a really big project that you have to get done under a short period of time, to say, okay, maybe I'll try to carve out a smaller project. And most of the focus of my project is on developing those relationships. And maybe that's enough for my PhD or for this postdoc. And then we'll develop, if it's going well, we'll come up with a follow-up proposal and do the next step together. So looking at that, this is the initial step. We don't have to do a huge project together right now. This can just be phase one, and we'll think through later on what the next steps are. And then I guess the last thing I would say is just that, it's also important for us to be gentle with ourselves, because it can be, really, it can be hard and uncomfortable trying to figure out the best pathway forward. And so just to recognize that it's a learning process. Like I've tried to be clear here on this panel that I don't use co-production perfectly, and I'm still learning, and I'm still trying to move my research in that direction. And it's not always something that you can just immediately know how to do it. It's something that you can, we should all be making our best effort and learn as much as we can, but also be aware that we'll continue to learn as our careers unfold. So I think those are the suggestions I have. I guess I don't have a lot of really practical ideas of places people can get funding, but I loved that question. And I think one of my suggestions was that perhaps PSECO can help organize some advocacy around this, because it is really hard to get funding to go and start to build relationships unless you have a mentor or a senior person that you're working with who can help support you. So there could be some work to try to identify, places that could develop some seed grants to fund some initial trips to communities, or initial, trips to visit conferences where the community members will be present, like Margaret mentioned, the Alaska Forum on the Environment. And there's other projects, ArcticNet, there's other places in Canada that serve as those kind of collecting spaces where you'll be able to meet some community members and have some of those conversations. But the National Science Foundation, or the Canadian funding bodies, they should think about that, and maybe there's a way to advocate and get them to come up with some small seed grant funds to help support relationship building. I think that would be a really terrific advocacy project.
Thank you, Noor. And I really love the idea about PSECO having a seed funding for that. It's a great idea. We're at the top of the hour, but I would love to see if Saas has anything to add to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Tash. Yeah, I think Noor was right about talking about the system. And I think it is not an early career fault that the system or funding agencies or academic institutions establish tight timelines, right? And I would suggest that funding agencies and educational institutions should reconsider the policies and regulations, which are short in time to do PhD, for example, or postdoc. And I think building relationships with indigenous communities is a long process, right? And this involves building trust, respect, and reciprocity. And they are not built in one day. So probably it is institutional concern to or interest to reconsider all these timelines, deadlines, and probably it would be better for our early career folks. That's my input. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're at the top of the hour. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and I will open this to any of the panelists who would like to answer. So the first question is, if you are not Indigenous to an area, what are the most important protocols and things to keep in mind with working with a new community?
And you put the questions in the chat too, Tosh. I don't know if that's possible, but that would be great.
That'd be great. And if panelists would like to take the question, I'll encourage you to use the raised hand function, and then Tosh can call on you from there.
Great, Margaret, if you want to, if you want to start, and then I was going to say Julia.
Thought I unmuted myself, but didn't quite click. I think the most important thing is really respecting Indigenous self-determination. I think you can go about it like wanting to help, which is generally, I think, a lot of people feel like, but then that kind of ends up, you kind of start inching into like saviorism mindset, which then doesn't really help. And so I think it is just like, you know, to respect Indigenous self-determination, I think is pretty foundational across all Indigenous communities. You know, there are a lot of cultural differences. And I think that's also then leads into like why respecting Indigenous self-determination is really important. And so really co-production knowledge kind of supports that aspect in allowing Indigenous, your partners, to really self-define what the project should look like and what their role is, as well as respecting Indigenous sovereignty and that aspect of self-determination in the sense of like really prioritizing what they're trying to do as a community in general is really important. So that's, to me, probably like the number one thing to think about.
Thank you, Margaret. Julia, did you have your hand up as well?
I did. I can't seem to, I don't know if I haven't updated my Zoom or something, but I can't find the hand thing. Anyway, I just wanted to add to what Margaret said. Everything that she said was absolutely, I echo that. I wanted to add that I think that this is also where legacy, building on legacy can be really important, especially if you happen to be working with others that might already have established relationships with the community that can, you know, who trust you and are willing to, you know, provide those introductions as well. That's really important. Working with like a supervisor that might have a long-standing relationship and is willing to, again, act as a as an interlocutor. But I think the biggest thing is, you know, anytime you're trying to establish a new relationship, is to not have, you know, to not go into that relationship with these sort of large expectations or pressures, but instead to really use that as an opportunity again to listen and learn. And it becomes even more important, I think, if you are, you know, for someone who identifies as non-Indigenous or not from community, and is seeking to develop relationship with an Indigenous community or community organization, to go at that from a place of wanting to learn and wanting to listen, and from there allowing a relationship to take shape on its own, and see, you know, what are the questions, and what is the why of the research, as a comment that was made earlier. Why is it important, and are you the person? Are you the person to do that work? Are you the person that the community is identifying as someone that they want to collaborate with, and having that humility in the same way that Noor was talking about earlier?
Thank you for that, Julia. Is there anyone else from our panelists who would like to answer that question? Otherwise, we have a couple more. Okay, so the next question is, how do you balance your own cultural identities with the culture of the people you advocate and work for? A really hard question. Great, Noor.
I don't think I do a good job of this, but I will say that I think this is sort of the point that Bernice made in the chat. I want to make sure everyone saw that, because it was a really helpful comment about how, you know, one of the most important things is just being vulnerable and bringing your whole self into the relationship and into your research. And I think we're trained, you know, even in the traditional, you know, Western education system, you're trained to keep your private self separate from your intellectual self, or your knowledge seeking and learning self. And that's not the way to do collaborative research based on relationship with communities, because that's not, you know, it's not a natural way of being, really, I think, for anybody. It's something we learn, and we learn to keep ourselves, to withhold parts of ourselves. So as we become, you know, for myself, as I become better and more comfortable, I'm trying to learn to share more about myself and my personal life and my identity. But I'm not very good at it. So sometimes I still have to remember and be reminded by others who, you know, begin with an introduction about who their parents are and where they came from, and kind of where they were raised, and who their children are. You know, there's lots of things that we can share, I think, through our work, and we should do more sharing. And so, you know, one of the things that I've been trying to do with some of the Aloka meetings that we have is to add in questions, just to have people, before we start talking about the topic at hand, to add in some questions to ask people, like, what are your favorite seasonal foods right now? And usually our Indigenous or community partners will have lots of interesting and delicious sounding foods to share. And then I have to think about what the seasonal foods are in where I live, and share more about that. It's not something that we necessarily reflect on normally. So that's just a very simple example, but it's an important question, and something where I think probably others in this group actually do a better job. So maybe I'll stop talking and let somebody else make some suggestions.
Thank you, Noor. Is there anyone else from our panel who would like to answer this question? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. We can always come back to questions too, though, if you suddenly have an answer that you would like to share. So the next question from the Q&A is, the panelist said something akin to co-production often doesn't focus on outcomes, but a lot of learning comes through the process of study. How do you convince funders of this value? Margaret, go ahead.
I think a lot of it is just, you just justify, basically, is the thing. It's like you need just to provide that justification of why it's important, and be convincing. I think it's very awkward. I think, writing my first proposal, it's a pretty painful process. Like just a lot of not knowing what you're doing and figuring it out, and a lot of anxiety around it. But kind of once you start doing it, and again, I'd ask people too who do it for examples. I've had people share their proposals with me, and I've learned a lot through that process. I'm also willing to share my proposals, that type of thing. But I think it is just like justifying it. I think it also helps too that I think in the context of like navigating the Arctic and stuff like that, at least with NSF and in general, as well as you see with NOAA, is like it's a hot topic right now, studying the process of how we do it better and how we improve funding. And so it's pretty timely.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to open up the floor to any of our panelists.
Yeah, I'd like to add as well, like, when you write your proposal, it's not about like, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not about writing for, purposes of ticking the box in like indigenous inclusion or, I don't know, like diversity, whatever box, but it should be like an honest a proposal to engage indigenous communities and to solve indigenous needs and issues, right? Not for this political or academic agenda.
Thank you, Saas. So the next question is a pretty big question. We're going to ask it anyways. How do you create systemic structures that fund and prioritize authentic long-term relationship building? Julia.
I think that there is such an important role and responsibility for anyone who is doing this kind of work or seeks to do this kind of work to advocate for increased direct research funding to Indigenous communities themselves, so that they can define the research needs, and also just the way that funds are given, the protocol around around reporting, around the way that research projects are evaluated. I strongly believe in this, and this is something that we're seeing happening more and more in Canada under efforts to essentially indigenize the research funding and governance framework in the context of this country. And I think that ultimately the end goal is really providing direct access for communities to research funds that aren't being kind of predetermined in terms of what their necessary research foci need to be, for example. So that's like, in terms of like totally reimagining funding frameworks and research governance, that would be something that I would say is, to me, a part of our role, as well as kind of advocating for these big structural changes that enable also cultural change in terms of how we think about research and how we think about outcomes.
Thank you for that, Julia. Yeah, that was a really hard question, and I really appreciate that answer. Is there anybody else from our panel who would like to take that question on? Okay, the next question is, how do you approach language barriers in terms of understanding and not excluding or dominating by speaking English?
I can answer. I spoke my native Sakha language, so it was not difficult. And I think my fellow community members, they perceived me as a mediator between scientists and policymakers. So they trusted me to sort of to inform policymakers and scientists about the needs and about the problems. So it was not that difficult for me to communicate with my people. Yeah. And English, of course, is not spoken there. Thank you.
Thank you, Saas. Go ahead, Margaret.
I was going to add too, I mean, it's not just like English as well. I think with academia, there's a lot of jargon, like even co-production knowledge itself. And there's just like a lot. And I think it's hard to engage people when you already have like a system going, basically. So in my context, like Arctic observing, like there's so many acronyms, it's insanity. Even coming in with a background in science and permafrost, there's just so much to understand. And I think it takes a long time to understand, and like, you know, supporting people who you're bringing in to have the time to understand that, thinking about creating also like basically like an introductory to like the structure that's there that you're going to participate in. And then I think functionally too, I think really having great, if you're going to have meaningful dialogue that's not jargon filled, that's really meaningful. I think having really good facilitation is really good, do the culturally appropriate facilitation. So also like kind of what Stas was speaking about in the sense of that aspect would be really important, as well as for myself. When I was like several years ago, I took a really great facilitation training. I was actually looking up the link so I could share it. If you're a Alaska or US based, Alaska Humanities Forum has a really great facilitation where we learned how to build community. So we had like a lot of really difficult conversations around like racism and homelessness. And so it was kind of really eye-opening on like how you support those types of dialogues. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I would recommend is the facilitation aspect, as well as if you're going to ask someone to participate in something, really having the time and giving them the support to understand what's happening.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you for sharing that link. I'm going to look into that as well. Noor, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think that whoever asked the question probably had something more nuanced in mind, but I will just add that one of the things a very practical thing to keep in mind is to budget plenty of money for interpretation and translation. So when you're putting together a project proposal, you know, that's a really essential role when you're communicating across different languages, and the compensation levels tend to be high, as they should be, because it's a really a critical role, and you know, having a really good interpreter with a lot of experience makes a huge difference, especially when you're getting at some of those questions of nuance that are, you know, the really nuanced details that can make all the difference when you're co-producing knowledge. So practically speaking, just make sure that you add in plenty of money in your budget for that really important role. And for the important role of facilitation, if you don't have those skills, because that is also something that you can budget for and bring someone in who has that background and experience.
Thank you, Noor. Is there anybody else on our panel who would like to answer this question? We have a couple more from the audience. All right, the next question is, how can a physical science researcher without a background in co-production start to incorporate co-production of knowledge into their projects? Go ahead, Noor.
Well, I think a good place to start is the same place that you would maybe start with any kind of research project, which is just in having some open-ended conversations with potential collaborators or community partners about what their interest is, and what your experience is, and what your interests are, and then, you know, through a very open-ended discussion, identify or explore whether there's points of common interest that could be the foundation for working together. I have seen a lot of researchers come at this the wrong way, which is to assume that what they're working on has inherent interest or value, and then approach the community and say, would you like to partner on this project? Or, you know, we want to work on our climate models, and we'd like to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our models. And so we have to back up a step and think about what is a model, and, you know, what's that foundational piece that the communities would be getting out of participating or engaging in that. So a starting place would be to back up and say, well, I work on models and here's what they are, and I have this interest, but I don't know, is that something that you're interested in? Here's how I could see some value potentially, but maybe I'm really wrong. I'd be curious to hear if you see value there. So to begin just from a place of curiosity rather than assuming, and then see if that opens up a pathway to work together.
Just going off of that, it made me think of this question that I think is related to this first question is it appropriate or possible to incorporate co-production in a project that's already ongoing? Because we've heard a lot about how co-production is something that you incorporate into the design, and you incorporate in every single step. So if you already have a project, can you incorporate it? Go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah, I think it's part of the struggle. I think, you know, if you're following the hard, fast rules of a co-production knowledge project is no, it can't really be, because you didn't co-produce a lot of those things. And I think a lot of it, for it to become co-production knowledge, basically you have to step back to the beginning. And that's something I've had to do in the project I'm on, is really having to step back and be like, this is not going to work out. And then figuring out how to do it. And it's just like, but then all the support systems you have in place don't necessarily support that work. And so then you're having to kind of settle for different things, and like, that's fine. And then it ends up becoming like really like learning about the process a lot. Then trying to like, yeah, I think it's, to me, that's more important is like, you know, having the process be good rather than trying to just push through and get the deliverables that were planned done. I think for me, that's very non-negotiable. I think other people might have different perspectives. But if the process isn't good, then I don't think the outcomes are good.
Thank you, Margaret. Is there anyone else on our panel who wants to speak to this as well? I think this is a really important question. Yeah, Noor.
Well, I've had experiences like the one that Margaret has described, where I think people naively think, oh, we can, develop a proposal without input and then retroactively let's co-produce it once it's funded. And I've seen them fail in similar ways that Margaret is describing. So I think often it's not possible. But I would say that depending on who's involved in the project and their true desire and interest in shifting focus and becoming more attentive and collaborative to these relationship building practices, it is possible to change the focus midstream and to learn, and assuming you're not attached to specific outcomes that had been designed from the beginning, but are really willing to reallocate resources and reallocate process and reallocate focus. I think it is possible to start to shift towards co-production. It wouldn't be co-produced. The project wouldn't be co-produced, but it would be trying to move in that direction. So I think I mentioned in the beginning that I think Aloka is somewhere in that phase of that process of trying to reorient ourselves in the direction of co-production. And we're a network of partners. And so some of the partners that we work with, we've had those relationships that are longstanding. And I think we've maybe are closer to co-production in those relationships and the products that we're developing together. And others are newer, and those partners weren't involved with developing our current NSF proposal, for example, so they weren't able to give feedback and shape the direction. So I think, it is possible to implement some of the lessons or learnings from co-production, but it really does require that everybody involved is on board and really wants to prioritize that. Otherwise, as Margaret said, it's probably not going to be successful.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes, which we do need to save 1 or 2 for conclusion. So I just want to open the floor to the panelists for any closing thoughts or answers to other questions that we had asked earlier.
I had a thought earlier when we were talking about kind of the systems and not being able to change the systems. I just, with the researchers I work with, I make it pretty clear that's kind of my motivation to doing my work is to change the system, which I know makes probably a lot of researchers pretty uncomfortable. And then that's kind of their choice to not work with me. And generally that's not the type of projects I want to work on anyways. And I think that's kind of something important for early career is a message in the sense of I think quite often you feel like you're in a box, you're getting kind of pushed through a certain way and you're trying to be a certain type of researcher, but it's just research is ever changing, science is ever changing. And I think it is just really having more of the mindset, you're future leaders. You're going to be envisioning what research looks like in the future. So you might as well start having that mentality now. And I think when you have that mentality, you're quite often more of a successful researcher in that sense. And so I think just wanting to put that out there is just, you're the future leaders of research. So you should really have that mindset.
Thank you so much for that, Margaret. I had a paragraph written for conclusion, but that is a better way to end this. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, for our panelists for being here, and I'm going to pass it off to Mariama for the last few closing remarks.
Okay, I'm just going to leave it on this slide because Zoom's glitching. Yes, thank you everyone, to the panelists for participating, for the participants for showing up and hopefully taking some of this really valuable information away with you into your own research lives and sharing it with others. We would love your feedback. Please fill out the post-event survey in our chat. This helps us understand, or that will soon be in the chat. This helps us understand the value that people find from our events and what to do in the future. We hope you found it useful and encourage you to attend some future PSECO events, some of which are located on this screen here. We will also just got a question about if the recording will be posted. Yes, the event has been recorded, and within the week it should be up on the PSECO website. And thanks again, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Tosh for organizing the panel and moderating it, and for your wonderful questions. So here's to transforming those systems and creating better ones so that we're valuing all folks within partnerships of research. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.